This is the Positive EQ Perspective, where you'll find a more positive outlook on life by developing your emotional intelligence. My name is Kirsty Gwynn. I'm a coaching psychologist and speaker, and I'm passionate about helping people to experience more calm, contentment, and joy every day. Today we're talking about how to feel more at peace with uncertainty. So if there's one thing that's bound to trigger anxiety, it's uncertainty. When things are uncertain, it's only natural to find yourself getting caught up in worry spirals, trying to predict all the ways that things might go wrong so that you can be prepared. And most of us would rather know which way things are going to go, even if the outcome is not ideal, than have to sit in that really uncomfortable middle space where we're still in the dark, still waiting to find out. So today, let's take a look at how we can feel less anxious and more at peace when it comes to uncertainty. So one thing that you'll likely notice your mind doing when things are uncertain is predicting the future and often jumping to the worst conclusion. So maybe you find yourself deciding that since you haven't heard back about that job interview, that means that you definitely haven't got the job, and you might even decide that and kind of come to terms with it. Or that since that client hasn't replied to your project proposal that you sent over, clearly they are just not interested. And in a way, jumping to the worst conclusion feels less vulnerable sometimes than sitting with the uncertainty of not knowing. But the reality is that it creates a lot of negative emotion that sometimes turns out to be unnecessary. After all, there are times when you end up finding out that you actually did get through to the next round of interviews and maybe they were just slower at the process than you expected, or that client had a crazy week, some unexpected things had happened and they were just delayed in getting back to you. And having to deal with those feelings of disappointment, sadness, regret, having to deal with all that negative emotion and essentially come to terms with some negative outcome that hasn't actually happened yet. Having to deal with those feelings only to find out that they weren't necessary, that can really get in the way of us living a joyful life, and it can make us feel like we're on a bit of an emotional roller coaster. That we had to have this dip in, this kind of low period of negative emotion when later we find out, oh, it actually turned out okay. So what can you do when you notice yourself slipping into this kind of worst case scenario thinking? So one thing that can be really helpful is to recognize that this is the brain's natural response to uncertainty. The protective system in your brain wants to protect you, wants to keep you safe. And one way that it does this is by filling in the blanks and preparing you for the worst. And I'm sure you can recognize that this can be really helpful at times, right? There's probably been times when your protective system has warned you of something going wrong, and then you have actually been able to prepare as a result of that. But then there are also times when we've had all these negative thought spirals, all this negative emotion, and then we find out that that worry it wasn't justified, right? Afterwards, when we realized that it turned out better than we expected. Meanwhile, we've already come to terms with the negative outcome, and in some situations, it's not even happening. And in those cases, it can be absolutely exhausting. So the key is to recognize when your mind is creating these negative stories, and just to start out by pointing out to yourself that these are just that. They're thoughts. They're stories that the mind is making up about the future. They're not facts. And when I say they're not facts, I mean they're not our reality, at least not yet. A lot of these times these things haven't even happened. And so we just want to remind ourselves to step back and remember that this is not reality. These are things that my mind is coming up with as a way to prepare me. So by doing this, you will be able to remain aware of potential problems. A lot of the time people worry, well, I wouldn't want to be completely blindsided when things go wrong, right? There is, of course, a healthy balance of negative thinking versus positive thinking. And if we were to always think everything's going to work out and never feel prepared, that could also be pretty painful emotionally. But we want a balance, right? So by doing this, you're going to be able to be aware of potential problems, but you won't get as tangled up in believing them. So you can kind of take a breath and remind yourself that you just don't have enough information to reach a conclusion yet. Yes, the thought's one possible option, but it also may not turn out to be true. So just reminding yourself that you can't know for sure can really take some of the heat out of those thoughts. Right? It can make them feel less overwhelming. It can help you to keep an open mind when it comes to the future, and that will help you to feel more at peace with the uncertainty. So one way that I applied this was when the pandemic first happened, and we saw kind of the first time ever that this virus was really sweeping the globe, and businesses were closing their doors and things like that. And I have a lot of in-person contracts where I teach courses and things, but since I run my own business, they're all freelance. And immediately what happened for me is I just went into all this negative thinking of I'm going to have no work, and it's just all the things that would mean in terms of my income and everything, and exacerbated by the fact that both my husband and I are both freelancers. So I just really saw this kind of future of what are we going to do, right? And how I dealt with that and what I found really helpful was just to recognize my mind is storytelling. There's uncertainty here. I'm lacking information. And so what my brain is naturally doing as a way to keep myself safe is filling in the blanks, and it's going to offer me up the worst case scenario because it doesn't want me to not be aware of that, right? So all I would do is I would just ground myself and remind myself, okay, I can't predict the future. I don't know what is going to happen, and I'm going to deal with each situation as it happens, right? So what I was really trying to guide myself to do is not pre-experience all this emotional distress that I didn't know whether that was valid yet or not. Ultimately, in my situation, it didn't turn out to be valid. I ended up being able to move all of my contracts online, which was a surprise with some of the contracts. I didn't expect that would be possible with those specific ones. But of course, the reality is that a lot of people, especially in the pandemic, would have had that worry and had it come true, right? So this is not to say that we're saying, oh, okay, it won't be a problem or this won't happen, but rather that we're able to kind of hold the uncertainty, recognize that things are uncertain, and prevent ourselves from jumping to the worst conclusion and pre-experiencing that, recognizing I need to wait for more information until I decide what to do or I have a reaction, right? And just doing that can feel incredibly grounding, and it can also put a pause on those negative thought spirals or take a lot of the that kind of pull out of them, that heat out of them, or they can often feel so compelling and so overwhelming. And just being able to say, I don't know for sure, right? These are thoughts, not facts. This situation that I'm imagining, my mind has made it up at this point. It hasn't happened, at least not yet. And so I'm gonna just push pause on my reaction and wait for more information until I kind of come to a conclusion or a decision about this. The second thing that we can do is bring our attention back to the present. So ultimately, if things are feeling uncertain, it's because you aren't in control of what happens, and that feels pretty scary. Right? That's one thing that triggers anxiety. We know that the minute that we feel like we're unclear about the future, that triggers anxiety, as we've just spoken about. The minute that we feel that we aren't in control of preventing a bad outcome or bringing a good outcome about, that is going to trigger a lot of fear and anxiety. But one thing that you can control is where you choose to place your focus. So maybe right now it feels like all of your attention is just drawn into the future where you're worrying about how things might go. But you have a lot of power when it comes to your intention and to your attention, not intention. And over time, you can train yourself to respond to negative thoughts by shifting your focus back to what's happening in this moment. So right now, you're experiencing this very moment through your senses. You're tuned into your hearing right now, and you can hear the sound of my voice, presumably, if you hear me say this. Is there anything else that you can hear? You're just tuning into your hearing. Also noticing, what can you see around you? What can you see around you? And then, can you feel your feet on the ground? Or perhaps while you're listening to this, you're walking and you can feel your footsteps. Maybe you're eating lunch and there are tastes and smells that you can tune into. Each and every time that your mind wanders, instead of trying to squash those thoughts, which unfortunately never works, no matter how many times I try it, just try to switch your focus to what's happening in the present moment. So the more that you practice this, the more you'll find you're able to live in the moment and notice that those uncertainty-driven thoughts, they start to feel less powerful. Often by the time we've tuned into our five senses, the thoughts have faded more into a sort of background noise instead of something that is overwhelming us and feeling really compelling. And this can form the foundation for feeling more peaceful and less anxious when it comes to uncertainty. Well, that's it from me. Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. Every subscriber counts, and it helps this information to reach more people. Thank you, and I'll see you next week on the Positive EQ Perspective. If you're looking to calm negative thoughts, accept yourself, and live joyfully, then you need my free roadmap to overcome negative thinking. You'll discover 7 steps to follow, as well as 3 mistakes most people make trying to improve their mindset and life that only make things worse. Visit positiveeq.com/free. That's positiveeq.com/free.